Sorry about the speedy transition here. We're going to have to clear the stage, have you all sit down, get comfortable. Thank you for staying with us, and we're now moving to the last panel of the afternoon. And I'm going to just briefly introduce our panelists and then join them at the seating area to my left. So leading off our conversation on public-private partnerships, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome His Excellency Mohammed Al-Abbar, who many of you know is the chairman of Emaar Properties, which is the leading property developer in the Middle East, based out of Dubai. And he has tremendous experience of large-scale infrastructure development, especially in urban communities, and was just telling us, I hope I'm not betraying a confidence, but just telling us in the green room about a new project in Belgrade, Serbia, which he has just returned from, and I hope he'll share some of that with us in a moment. We then will hear from Roland Busch, who is the CEO for Infrastructure and Cities for Siemens. Siemens, obviously, a company with a great tradition of expertise in developing infrastructure in emerging economies. We will, I beg your pardon, we will hear second from Saeed Al-Hadi, from Morocco. He is an expert on infrastructure development who was very much involved in overseeing the development of the Tangier Port project, which some of you may know is now developed into one of the leading ports in the Mediterranean. And then finally, we'll hear from John Sfakianakis, who is the Chief Investment Strategist for MASIC, which is based in the Kingdom. And John, of course, many of you know him, has a long experience of working in the Kingdom and this region. So please join me in welcoming the four panelists to our conversation. We'll start off straight away with Mohammed Al-Abbar. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists. I would like to thank my colleagues attending today and those who organized the conference. This is a very interesting part of the conference. And when you talk about, of course, the partnership that we're looking at, or we're talking about infrastructure, please keep in mind that I think we should really look at this holistically. Which means that when we talk about infrastructure, in this part of the world, we only think about highways. So when we look at infrastructure, we are talking about human life in general. It's all of it. The buildings, the roads, the parks, the water, the electricity, the schools, the healthcare. And one of the most challenging elements in the whole process is time. Without a doubt, I think UK and France are probably, 400 years ahead of us? 200 years?
It won't respect.
Just development, infrastructure, age.
Oh, I don't think you'd want to dig too deeply under the London Underground system.
Sure. But what I'm saying is that we are really short of time.
Yeah.
We, in this part of the world, majority of the population are young. They are connected to the world. They understand that they need a better life, and because of technology, they want it tomorrow. So the pressure on the private and the public sector and on government to perform and provide a better life and better infrastructure holistically is so serious. Now, of course, no doubt, we've lived in a process where I think there are many people who were entitled to get projects, and no doubt, previous years that was the trend, and I think it was okay. I think a lot of people did very well for the environment that we've lived in, but keep in mind that nowadays I think ability of organization to participate in such projects is becoming the true guiding principle. to create such partnership between governments and between the private sector. But governments have to as well move a little faster. They have to understand the business that they would like to relate across and create that partnership. So the bureaucratic process in the government, really, without criticizing, really have to get going, because the element of time and people need infrastructure. That is one. But at the same time, on the private sector, companies like us who would like to go into this partnership, I think we also have a duty and have responsibility. No doubt we're all good at criticizing governments, and I think some governments are really worth of criticizing because they're pretty slow and they get, everything is complicated. But we as a private sector, I think it's about time that we also become good citizens. What is good citizens? We have to do the right thing. We have to do things well. And we are so blessed in this part of the world that we don't pay corporate tax and we don't pay income tax. And if we do a good job, we'll get most of the work. So governments also, even if we are to criticize them, they're looking for good partners with a heart. And I think I'm in the business, many of our organizations, they are loose on the heart bit. Because for you to do good business, you have to have good principles. Do everything right. But remember, you have to be extremely fast because time is not on your side. Therefore, I think, I don't want to blame it on one part. I think both of us, private and public, have to work much harder. Private sector have to show their goodwill and they have to push and get the job done right. Of course, all reports are indicating that there is a need of investment in infrastructure holistically of $100 billion a year, which is a lot of work. A lot of organizations have to get involved. So the governments have to get going with things, and the private sector have to be worthy of that investment and that trust. I have two great examples of what we've done is that what we've done in the company regionally, but out of the UAE. I think it was a great partnership between the government and we as a company, because we've been swapping land for shares, but we have to execute, we have to deliver, we have to get things done. I think being a public company have put pressure on us to perform and get things done, which was really great. And I think corporate governance rule also made us behave much better, because we're human beings. We need the stick to behave. And that's why God promised us hell or heaven. He knew, right? He knew. The other thing, of course, Saudi Arabia, we have a fabulous example in King Abdullah City, which has followed the same principle and it's going in the right direction. Of course, we failed miserably in one project, which is we announced a large-scale, low-cost housing company. We couldn't get it going because we really needed government to support us on the land value, and we are willing to cut down our margin and just provide the service, because there's a huge need for low-cost housing, but we couldn't figure out how to do deals with government where the land can be coming in at a good value. But never mind. We have a new young people. They are starting a new company, and it will be announced the coming few weeks, and we will support them that way. My last comment is that I think government should not only focus on the partnership for power, water, highways, and all that. I think they should also support lifestyle infrastructure. Our people like life, and they want to live life. So life is about holistic approach to large-scale development, and not only focus on the hard infrastructure. Thank you so much.
Let me just ask you one quick follow-up question. In these public-private partnerships, sometimes you hear people say cynically that the public part of it is brought into play just to absorb the long-term capital risk that the private sector is unwilling to be exposed to. Would that be too simple a comment?
I think it will be too simple, because if you tell me that somebody should build a highway that's $2 billion, I'll tell you yes, it's long term, the government should. But if you tell me it's going to be a toll road, I'll tell you the government should have nothing to do with it. Mm-hmm. I think the private sector should manage their budget well, put their plan well, manage their financing well, and manage their business well, so you can recover your costs and make some money. So I think the private sector can do so much more on their own.
And what do you think the mood is in the region with respect to giving the private sector more responsibility to take on some of these utility type commitments and responsibilities? Is there a trend in that direction, or is it still very, very nascent?
I think the governments are starting that process. I would say that they're a little slow on it, at least from my experience, is that still governments, they want control, and especially if they're successful. And Dubai is a good example that government is not willing to let go of a lot of these infrastructure issues. I would say in the other part of the world, I think I blame it on the private sector, because private sector, and I operate in Egypt on a large scale basis, and the private sector have to be a good citizen. And in some countries and companies also, private sector is not behaving. The profit margin is too high, irresponsible socially, quality issues, long term. I think that's majority of countries.
Self-defeating.
Yes. In India, I operate in India, same thing, very irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, Saeed, let's go to you and Morocco. Sometimes it's said that the countries that have made the most progress in public-private partnerships are those which are resource weak. In other words, where the government does not have enough money to be able to provide it themselves, and therefore has to look, willingly or not, to the private sector for help. With that as a background, tell us a little bit about your experience with the Port of Tangier in particular, and what you see as the key success factors in public-private partnerships.
Thank you, John. Well, I had the chance and honor myself to be involved in about a dozen PPP deals, from structuring to deal making. I agree with you that the countries who were constrained in terms of financing had more chance to develop this kind of approaches. But actually, these approaches are not only, it's not the only benefits to finance projects. They bring in other benefits, like the quality of the public services, for example, the utilities or something. They may also help bringing in new businesses in the country. So, Mr. Abbar mentioned tourism, housing. So we can have a variety of examples where businesses can be really fueled in the country. In Morocco, we have the case, for example, of the automotive industry. Automotive industry, we have now a large-scale cluster in the north of Morocco, with the largest car factory in the Mediterranean and Africa, and with the dozens of equipment suppliers working for Europe, for the Mediterranean. And this was done based on the PPP approach. You mentioned the port of Tangier Med. It's one of the three largest now in the Mediterranean as container hub. It's based on PPP. There are other examples in Morocco. For example, the power sector. Since 15 years ago, all the thermal plants, power generations, the wind plants, and now the solar plants, all of them are privately done. And that's important to ensure project delivery on time and the quality of service. Now, there are many models of PPP that you can find. From the simplest to the most sophisticated. And it's getting more and more sophisticated, actually, because of partly what Mr. Abbar mentioned, the social requirements, the accountability issues from the government side. So I think the most important thing is that government must ensure that they have the capabilities to deal with this sophistication, because in general what we observe, even in countries like France and UK, is that the large international contractors are very well armed for such deals, which is not the case always for the local authorities and government authorities. So this is very important. And secondly, for the government, they have to look more broadly at the PPP approach. If they look at only deal by deal, well, it's good, because you can have very good deals done, but you can have very bad results from one deal. So I think it's very important for governments to make sure that they provide a suitable environment for PPP developments. And I would say there are 4 points in that. First one is the political commitments, because it's very important to have, I mean, not only the governments, but all the government agencies, bodies, the elected bodies that are believing in the PPP approach. And secondly, the appropriation of the PPP approach from the population is very key. And you have examples in Morocco. You have some examples where the population is a little bit resentful for the project. And when you have such resentment, it's a cause for the PPP. You have examples also in France. So the political commitment is very important. Then there is the PPP mindset within the administration, because the government officials are more used to buyer-supplier approach with the contractors. They are not, in general, I say, they're not used to the partner-to-partner approach, which is very different. Right. Which means that governments must ensure that the, let's say, entrepreneurship mindset is introduced into the government bodies, because the government becomes a partner in businesses, and the people must understand the mechanics of how it is working. Then there is the regulatory framework. Of course, you need a framework, because otherwise there are some legal issues. And then the fourth point is quite important. I think experiences have proven that it's a key element, is the PPP units. Now UK is improving its PPP units. France is trying to do the same. And some previous studies have shown that when you have a very good PPP unit, central units in the government, you can divide by 2 the process time. You know, the process time for PPPs is a key element, because you may gain time in terms of delivery of projects, but the process time and the financing time is very long. So with PPP units, you can divide by 2 the time. You can double the number of projects that you have, but most importantly, you increase the value for the government for the money given. And to finish my remarks, I would say that yes, PPP are very good for economic development, for making the financing of public projects easier, but PPPs are not always the preferred approach. I mean, if you are a government and you have enough financial levers, so you can have soft loans, you can have very good conditions, and you're talking about an infrastructure which is not very complicated to deliver and to maintain, maybe not necessary to go to PPP.
Right. So similar to Mohammed, time and speed are very important issues when you're developing and implementing a PPP.
Yes, because paradoxically, when you go to PPP with no preparation, you can spend more time on a PPP project than in a traditional conventional project, because you have a process time and then you have the financing time.
Right.
Financing time, projects finance takes a lot of time. Maybe 1 year for a project to be closed. That's a lot compared to.
So at Siemens, considerable cumulative experience in the PPP area and in infrastructure projects, the city of the future, and so on. What lessons can we learn from that experience that you've had, Roland?
Well, thanks. So let me start let's say, telling you a little bit what Siemens is all about regarding PPP. So we're working on the field of energy, industry, healthcare, and infrastructure in cities. This is my area of responsibility in the managing board. And as you can imagine, in these areas, when we talk about mobility and transport, energy, buildings, we are all the time in businesses, which is about working with the public as a private company. So we have a lot of experiences, and actually it's a blend of experience. So there's good ones and bad ones, and I give you, let's say, 3 examples very briefly in a minute. But before that, let me give you an idea, just a glance, a couple of numbers regarding the PPP market in Europe you might be interested in. So it peaked in 2007. It was a 30 billion market by then, more than 130 projects, and it fell down over the years. 2011, 18 billion, 2012, 11 billion, 85 and 60 projects. mainly driven by UK, followed by France, Netherlands, and then others. And the key areas are, you can imagine, it's transport, followed by education, and then comes the public sector, healthcare, and other areas. So we have a blend of businesses. And from that perspective and from the figures you see, it's not always the choice. So it really depends on the time, and it depends also on the availability of money from the one perspective, but also from resources. I would like to highlight maybe 3 examples where we have good experiences. And one is the airport in Bangalore, where we started off in 2005, and within 3 years we delivered a full-fledged airport. It's a 500 million project where we have been providing the project management, the baggage handling, security, power supply, IT, including financing. It was a very successful project to the success of the customer and of course the end customers as well. So we delivered in time, very successful. All the framework was laid out nicely. Another one, which is just in execution, is Thameslink, 2 billion project. Here it's a different character. We're delivering trains. It's more than 1,000 trains, which we're delivering, including maintenance and depot. And you would not believe it, but this, and talking about complexity, this, it seems to be simple, delivering some trains and depots. There are 134 contracts going along with that kind of project. And the last one, which I'm very proud to say, it's also a project which is also PPP, maybe not in a puristic sense. It's the Metro Riyadh project, which we recently won in a consortium with Bechtel, Al-Mabani, and CCC. And I think you know more than very much about that project, of course, living in that region. To close my comments, the frame, the conditions, if you start a PPP, has to be right. And I give you some ideas what I mean with that. Number one, it's fully empowered authority with the right level of resources from the public perspective. This includes, of course, the regulatory framework and the quality of advisors who are supposed to have maybe more than once in a lifetime experience. On the other side, it's about the right technology partner. If you do not have the right technology, you cannot define the right level of interfaces and specifications. The other one is allocation of responsibility and the risk sharing. For example, we are hesitating, and I'm not speaking only for Siemens, for other companies as well, taking, for example, ridership risk. That's something which the public sector should have in their hands. And after all, it's really about the right, let's say, projects that are in the right spirit, but this is now the soft factors which are important as well. Structured right, you have quite a bit of work at the beginning. I mean, PPP projects are complex, so you have to take into consideration, but once you structure it right, then you really can save time because you bring the right competence and the right decision bodies together, including a proper financing, and then you can take it off. So overall, I would say it's a good model, but it's not a silver bullet which solves all the problems.
Okay. Is there any trend in the build, own, operate sense, and perhaps sector by sector?
It is. In particular, if you go for the transport area, it's getting more clear that if you provide not only the technology, but also the right level of maintaining it and operate it from the perspective that it's a technical operation. That means we guarantee the availability of technology. Then you can realize that, of course, if the company who knows their technology and know their ropes, if it maintains it, it has a much, much higher reliability thereafter. Right. And that comes also with lower cost.
Right, good. John, plenty of experience in the kingdom and the region. What have you learned about the viability of PPPs here? What tips would you give someone in the private sector who might be thinking about doing a PPP?
Well, first of all, I would say that PPPs make a lot of sense from a point of view of efficiency, timeliness, and at the same time productivity. So overall, the academic evidence is there, to showcase that it's very important that you have PPPs in many different structures and sectors. What is the differentiating point in the Middle East is that you have certain cases in North Africa where you have experience and depth in PPPs, and more recently in the GCC, you have a nascent PPP structure. And this is where we need to pay attention. In Saudi Arabia, over the next 10 years, we will be seeing upwards of $750 billion of infrastructure spending. This is a massive amount that requires the participation of the private sector. And the private sector here has an obligation, but also the government has an obligation. Number one, we need to have a legislative structure and regulatory structure. We have it in Kuwait, we don't have it in Saudi Arabia. I believe in Dubai you're underway, so you're kind of ahead on that. So before we do anything, we need to have that in place. Number two, the message to the private sector is that the government cannot write a check and just spend the money. Number three, the private sector needs to make sure that they provide and care for the local economy. So let's say Siemens, I'm participating in the Riyadh Metro, $27 billion. That's the largest metro project in the world. You're not going to see another one like this unless you go to Jeddah, which is the number 2 project. As Siemens, or not to use Siemens in particular, I would think hard, what do I give back to the society and to the economy? Not just employment, but also technology, know-how. And this is very important. So my intention is for the government to look at the details when they negotiate, but also for the private sector to look more carefully at what they give back. Another example, over the next 20 years, Saudi Arabia, by 2032, clearly, they will have solar capacity. The announced amount is that 41 gigawatts of solar capacity will come online by 2032 in Saudi Arabia. The government is not going to be able to just write a check. So certainly for the private sector, not just local but international, there has to be more involvement. There has to be more economies of scale, but also efficiency. Having said that, the other point to the government is that we cannot do everything in 2 years or 3 years, because you have then efficiency problems, you have problems in terms of timeliness, and then when you run into problems in terms of finishing, then the costs rise. And as a government, I don't have the luxury to keep on spending forever. We have been very lucky over the last 11 years to benefit from what has happened in the global economy. But the next 10 years are not necessarily going to be riding on the gravy train. So be aware, but be aware as well, the private sector, that as you're participating, you need to be giving back.
Okay, excellent. I think because you as an audience have been very patient throughout the day, I want to make sure we open it up straight away to questions, because we haven't had enough time perhaps for questions to be asked. So if you could keep them brief, we'll try and get as many people in as possible. If we could have the microphone up front, please. We'll first of all take the gentleman on my right in front of me here, and then we'll go to you, sir, second. So number 1 here, please. Coming to you now.
Basil Al-Ghalayini, BMG Financial Group. My question is to Mr. Mohammed Al-Abbar. Since you are an active player in the regional market, how do you stay competitive, knowing that we are witnessing a shifting sands politics in within the Arab Spring? And obviously nobody has a crystal ball right now.
Well, it's really quite simple. We have an operation in Syria that's, of course, shut down. Now, how much you invested in that environment, and are you okay? You can afford such situation, and that's a risk that your balance sheet can handle. Then that's fine. So, but at the end of the day, you do all your homework, you analyze all the risk, but you can't really analyze everything. There's no guarantee. that you'll do this. I'll tell you a risk we've taken in Egypt, which turned out to be good for us. When the trouble started, of course, we're one of the top 5 players in Egypt. Everybody stopped in Egypt because of what's going on, and some people politically related to the government. We took a decision that we will never stop construction. Of course, laborers for 2 weeks ran away because everybody wanted to go back to his farm and illegally build a little house because there was no government at that time, and they've done that, and then they came back. They still want to work. So we went on building, and last year, our total sale in Saudi Arabia 2013 was 1 billion US. So you do your homework. You have to do your homework. And there's some other risk that you're going to take it, and you'll calculate that risk. And I really believe that responsible organization with proper behavior and doing your homework, you will make mistakes and you will take a little bit of risk. But I believe that it will be a calculated risk that you can handle, because we're in the risk business. And if you can handle some mistakes, I think you can manage well that way. But you can never really manage it totally right. And the environment is changing in this region, so you really have to be alert all the time. And we have 2 billion project under construction in Istanbul. And with the change in the environment in Istanbul, we also have to be cautious. Thank God that's still under control.
Right. At the same time, I think the expression of confidence to the people that comes from the private sector continuing with these projects unabated in the face of political uncertainty is also part of giving back. The private sector can give that confidence to the community.
And you're so right. If I show you some of the pictures of the advertising campaign that we ran during the revolution in Cairo, because all the billboards were empty in Cairo. So it was very cheap to get them. And I think we ran one line ad and we took over all the billboard. It was maverick, it was optimistic maybe, but our thinking is that there is no way that Schengen visa can be provided to 20 million people of Cairo to go to Europe. No way, will never happen. And you know what? Thank God it didn't happen.
Sure. Second question, please, at the front.
Yes, my name is Ghassan Al-Suleiman, and my question is to John. John, you briefly alluded to the issue of legislations. I would like to get your input on, out of all of the PPPs that you know of, or if there are any statistics, how many really did not go through, and mainly due to issues of governance? I didn't hear the issue of governance being mentioned in detail. And if there is a breach in contract in the PPP, how do you fight City Hall as a private sector?
Okay. Well, I didn't want to hide it, but it's a very important element, governance. Do not think that PPP is the solution to everything. There are failures, and usually we tend to understate the failures. In the case, for instance, of Australia, you have had a lot of evidence, academic evidence, that it hasn't done as well. So you need to look at the details, and the details in terms of risk. The private sector has a sense that risk is always on the side of the government, and the government believes that the private sector will build it and then they will get it back. There has to be a balance between the two. I think that what we've seen in the case of, for instance, Medina Airport in Saudi Arabia recently, I think it's a very good blueprint for many other projects to follow. And I think this is important, as I said before, because of the size of these projects. The state will not be able to just underwrite the whole thing. So I think you have an economy of scale challenge, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in other places. Having said that, it's important because international banks today are less willing to sign a check or to guarantee all of these projects. They are withdrawing back to their regions and countries, and the financial sector globally is changing, and that changes their risk appetite. Governance, going back to your question, is a key, and that's why it's important before you do these things to have the legislation. Right now, what we're doing in many parts of the world, including Saudi Arabia, is that we go on a project-by-project basis. So we need to start thinking in terms of the size, and we need to get it right, and the devil is in the details.
Third question on my right, and then we'll take the lady on the far side.
Thank you very much. My question is to Mr. Abbar. I remember when Mr. Abbar introduced his concept in Dubai and he's trying to apply it in Saudi Arabia. He faced many reality different, and that was really short thinking from his side, not to apply city government to whole nation government. And we asked him many questions. Unfortunately, he went, and I am sure the government and the public lost more money. If the government has done it, same like Jubail or Yamba, with the private, it might be more safer, more traditional. Again, he tried to make financial company in the stock market in Saudi Arabia, and just a few days they finished, and some of the shareholder, they lost their money without even, and he was a chairman, and there was same thing I think in also in Bahrain, and just selling dreams, comparing with a small city where the decision can be made immediately and no other competition is not. And I think the system to go it to private, and other example we see now, the privatization of desalination. I think this is the most important responsibility of the government. In desert country, you cannot just let the people wait on the mercy of some private sector. They are just want get the money, and this one are extremely important to create the industry supporting and to create the jobs for. Now desalination, we see plant with no Saudi, no condition of Saudization, and one day they will finish. Same thing what happened for electrical companies introduced in Pakistan. One day
Okay,
they stop. Thank you.
let's hold it there.
I want to know the question. May I ask, what's the question, just for clarity?
Well, I think if I can, perhaps encapsulate it a
Because the
little
private
bit.
sector maybe loses,
Yeah,
there's a chance of loss?
Yeah, I think that one point is that public-private partnership is sort of backdoor privatization of assets that the country cannot afford to let go on the cheap and shouldn't let go. And then secondly, concerns were expressed over some projects where the investors had not achieved the returns that had been perhaps in their minds promoted, which is just business risk.
Well, I think I started my speech about society that we live in, where I think the art of giving is part of our society. But the art of giving has no risk. And I'm glad that at least while I'm speaking, I keep referring to failures and I keep referring to mistakes that we can handle. Because we are born from day number one to take risk when we get out of our homes. Of course, I do differ with my friend. I made billions to people. I think if you add how much money I made for people to the 1 billion I lost in the States, I think it's probably 25 to 1. I think it's not too bad overall. The bank in Bahrain is doing extremely well. It's one of the largest today. The financial institution in Dubai, I think you're talking about, which is the mortgage company, is also doing extremely well, no matter what environment the city have gone through. But I think we also have a state of mind that, we always want to think in our part of the world that the government will take care of everything for us. It is true, but they can't anymore. They can barely fix our education. They can barely build the school on time to put up with the number of young people coming in. Healthcare is the same. They don't mean to do bad, but it's just the environment is becoming so sophisticated. What is the right solution? Nobody knows. It's probably a combination of all.
Yeah.
Singapore, people celebrate if your kid is accepted in the government company. You do a big celebration, while private schooling is not well respected in Singapore. So I think different environment, react to situation differently. But definitely, I do believe that I think some governments are good, they will do certain things, but many of them have failed. And I think if you look at the Western world and why private partnership will work, because the Western world have not been able to manage their budgets. They can't manage their budget. And I always joke about the US democratic system, and I always say that, the US talking highly of democracy, and they only have 2 political parties, and I always joke and I say, they can't even manage their budget. They fail to agree to get the budget going. So what I'm trying to say is that unfortunately, governments are in debt, private sector have to come in, but I said it, private sector have to be responsible private sector. They have to understand that.
Roland, from your experience, how would you respond to some of these concerns that you often hear about public-private partnerships and national assets being depleted?
So, I understand very well your point, and I also believe that the government should be very clear about what part of the infrastructure they want to, or how much would they want to control and have to control after all. But even then, you can run it in a public-private partnership, not taking your hands off and not dependent on a private investor. From our perspective, and I come back also to what John said before, we are going into a country to stay, not running in and doing a project and then leave. For us, it's more a sustainable model where you say once you start a project and you execute it, you want to leverage on that and go further. And that includes, of course, giving something back, like training, creating jobs, in particular in the service and maintenance area. Once you have this is where the bulk of the job you can create locally, because you cannot always open a factory for bits of vehicle manufacturing, for example. So after all, I guess if the frame is set up right, if both parties know what they can expect from each other, if we have a clear idea from the policy also of the government, what kind of infrastructure is on stake and what kind of control they want to have it, then I think your concerns might be mitigated.
Okay. Let's go to the lady on the far side in the ladies section. Please, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. This question for Mohammed Al-Abbar. Assalamu alaikum, Ma'am Sheikh. My question is referring to your earlier comment when you said government stop investing not only in roads or energy, they should also invest in life, because people need to have a good life. And I thought also to invest in good roads, hospitals, food, quality of life, infrastructure. Also, we deserve to have, this is what I mean, good life. So I just want to, if you could elaborate, what do you mean by invest in life compared what you should invest in a good city, for a good citizen, for accessibility, for quality of life?
Today as I drove the new, I was really happy to see the new road from Riyadh Airport, and it passed by the financial center. And you can't avoid, but you feel the sense of pride. Because the first time I drive this road that's just adjacent to the financial center. And you feel pride that something is happening. I truly believe government responsibility, when I say comprehensive life, pride is one of it. That we must make our people proud of their country and their city, and they feel the sense of pride and belonging. So, so that's a fabulous example. But if I were to look at example of us taking a military warehousing site, which many of you maybe you didn't see, 400 acres, we put in 12 billion US in it, which is the downtown Dubai nowadays, and we attract 75 million visitors a year, and I cannot tell you how much money we make out of it because it's very embarrassing. But it was done from the heart. Financial model is one thing, but the possibility of a family taking a walk, having a stroller with their kid, walking with pride and quality and a civilized environment that enhance the child's IQ and my 7-year-old daughter IQ to say I belong to a civilized environment, I think it's unmatched in value. And I think governments, and I don't blame them, governments mean well, I must tell you. But it's just sometimes we all need to support each other to show a vision, to see how can we execute the vision well. And that's what I'm saying. Private sector have a responsibility to be good. You are going to make profit, but be good. Do good quality stuff. And the private sector, as I said earlier in my speech, we don't pay taxes. I mean, we are so lucky. We don't want to tell the Europeans, because it's such a secret. So what's the reason not to do good? So the infrastructure will cover that element of me and my child, the park, the pathway, the pride, the schools, the beautiful buildings, the pride of passing by, Riyadh's financial center and feeling that pride that I belong to the world.
John?
It's critical too.
Yeah, It's great. I agree with you. It's good to have this sense of pride, but it comes at a cost. And the financial center is coming at a cost on the back of the state. And
at least I have my element that thank God is making great.
No, but the
and
private
sure
sector has to
they will
understand.
They will make some reasonable return.
I agree, but the private sector has to understand that there are limits to what the state can do. And going back to your earlier point about the West and budgets and deficits, this is why the private sector needs to work with the government in a partnership so that we don't have the same problems like the West. Because, alhamdulillah, we are at 2.6 debt to GDP in Saudi Arabia. It's the second lowest in the world. But I don't want to get into a situation where it increases, and it can increase if I get complacent. So I like very much what you say. I do love to see and have my people have this pride, because we are a pride nation. I consider myself Saudi after 11 years here. But I do want to have a partnership.
And I think just to wrap up, the last couple of comments highlight the need for us to focus not just on the hard infrastructure, but also on the soft infrastructure. And so much of the content now of PPP negotiated contracts, I think, is centered on the skill sets that are to be developed, need to be developed, and can be developed as a result of the hard infrastructure investments that are being made. So soft infrastructure goes along with hard infrastructure, and that should shape our thinking in the future on PPPs. Okay, I just want to thank you all for, we're going to have to stop here. I just want to thank you all for sitting through the final session of the afternoon and being such a good audience and very attentive. And please join me in thanking our panel members. Thank you.